Hello, community and disability class, and anyone at home following along with Disability Classroom. Happy you're here. I'm really sorry this is late, and I'm on the wrong slide. That's okay. Just keeping you on your toes, you know? My title slide for this, and this is, without a doubt, the toughest lecture I pitched for you this semester in terms of complexity of content, so I'm not too bothered if you don't follow everything I'm saying, because I'm not sure I follow everything I'm saying, particularly given I'm not American. But this was a long effort to put together, and I've simplified a lot of it for the sake of argument. This is kind of the best of what to hate about Medicaid, without going too deep into line-by-line policy making, but the great thing about Medicaid is you could pretty much pick a line at random and find something really ableist or poverty-hating about it. So in a way, this is a really easy lecture, insofar as, you know, I'm not going to run out of things to hate, but I'm going to give you a more broad strokes picture of what to hate, you know, in general about how Medicaid works. So the title slide says, America's Medicaid and Care Crisis, Introduction to America's, their equivalent to OHIP, for those of you in Ontario, their baseline healthcare policy, their OHIP plan, and disability studies. And I subtitled it, The Best of Human Rights Abuses Roundup for American Medicaid, because if you're not familiar with this argument, I'm about to blow your mind. Here we go. Reminder for cozy space holding. I know you know it. If you happen to be new and this is for some reason the first time you're seeing me speak, these are the ethics that I generally hold in spaces that I operate in. It's important to me that you know, and it's important to me that we agree to the same space sharing conduct. All I'm really asking for is, you know, freezing empathy, freezing gray space, so you're holding that with me in this space and giving, you know, give peace a chance kind of resistance and abolitionism ethics kind of thing. FNAM allyship. I'm with the Anishinaabe Drum Circle. They're a great group. Open access, low barrier. That's why these lectures are free, obviously. Co-designed expertise. Particularly for this lecture, I tapped a lot of American friends to, particularly when I'm reading stuff about the sub-policies that are informing the major policy. And I think it's really interesting and relevant that most of my friends said, yeah, I'm on Medicaid and I don't understand Medicaid. Or, I've been living here 30 years and I don't really know how that policy works, kind of thing. And I discovered that the further into the nitty-gritty you get, you can just look at it as a whole and not understand it. But the further you dig into it, it gets increasingly incomprehensible. It doesn't get more clear, it gets less clear. And I called it a policy nest, where you start with PHE, and then you go to ACA, and then there's these sub-policies underneath ACA, and then there's max factors that create the calculations for this, which creates the calculation for this. It's bonkers. You need multiple degrees to understand Medicaid. I am in the incredibly privileged position of being able to research with my free time as a job, and I sat here for a week just slamming my head off a wall trying to understand, you know, the finer mechanics of Medicaid. And the point is that people who are on Medicaid are from low income or generally, you know, low privilege households, so they don't generally hold multiple degrees to be able to understand this. And I joked to my American friends that these policies are designed clearly by people who hate poor people to punish poverty. And they all kind of agreed with that sentiment. So if you go into this with that general ethic in mind, I think that would help, along with my cozy space holding ethics. So, here's my what's on today. Here's your time-checked itinerary. I told my class because this is super late, because my life is falling apart. I'm gonna remove a lot of the components from the lecture, and I removed a lot of stuff about trying to understand how the policy works. I kept, I think, one slide in. And if you'd like to talk about, how that nesting works and what makes what calculation, I can do that with you. I just don't think it's helpful in an overview context. So this is a fairly simplified presentation. And again, I'm Canadian, so if you want to hit at me and correct me if you happen to have majored in American policy, that would be great. I am totally open to that. So I'm going to tell you kind of as an absolute intro, like here's how Medicaid works 2020 to present. I originally wanted to do pre-Obama and then Obama era and then Trump era, and it was too much. You'd have to do an entire course to go through that, and I indicated that at the bottom of the slide. Like, it's bonkers. I don't know how anyone follows that conversation. So I took post-Obama, Trump-ish era, but mostly Biden, 2020 to present, and what to hate about what's happening basically right now instead. But again, I have stuff prepared for that if you want to have that conversation, and it's not appearing in this presentation. And then I'm going to take the conversation that happened at the Washington Post that I put on your syllabus, and we're going to tie how Medicaid isn't working to modern crip care ethics. So people who work in mutual aid and the Dean Spade types and the Leah Lakshmi Pyetsna Samarasena types who do a lot of community care, or caremongering is a popular word for that now. We're going to talk about how that isn't addressed, but also how that's being addressed in the pandemic. And then originally there was a section about connecting that ethic to the academy. But there's a lecture next week on everything that doesn't work about academy care. And I thought I'll just save that content for students left behind. And I also removed, and I told you on Monday, you don't have homework this week. I took out the right space. Anybody who didn't hand in their read-around feedback already, please get that in. If you didn't do your read-around video, please put something in, and you can get one teammate to review it. I would be happy with that. Reach out to me, and let's have a jam directly, if that applies to you right now, okay? Also be using this week to catch up on right spaces that haven't yet been submitted. I'm not bothered if you hand them in late, and I just want to know what's up. So if you could do that, that would be fabulous. And let's get going. All right. So this is my extremely reduced how I see this policy working after reading government documents for hours and hours and hours. So you've got the FFCRA, which is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This was supposed to be the Medicaid boosting policy for when shit hit the fan with COVID, right? So that's the FFCRA, okay? And you're going to need to remember these, not metaphors, these acronyms, because they're gonna start nesting within themselves. So the FFCRA, basically what that did, among about 1,000 other things, in the context of Medicaid, was prohibit or prevent individual states from disenrolling people from Medicaid. And more often than not, the reason you get disenrolled for Medicaid is you haven't been paying partial coverage, or you haven't been paying the premium, or you haven't paid off debts that you've accrued through Medicaid on, what's it called? On the payment plan buyback or something. So in OHIP, you get 40% of your prescription medications covered, and that other 60% is for you to come up with in cash. Medicaid works much the same way, and they cover it's not even comparable, way less than OHIP does. And I have plenty to complain about in terms of what OHIP covers. So Medicaid is abysmal in that context. If you fall behind in these patient-led payments that are being subsidized by Medicaid, you can lose your Medicaid coverage, which is like losing your OHIP, which I don't think that's possible in Ontario. As long as you're a citizen, that's kind of a default. Like, you get that. Immigration is a different situation, obviously. So the disenrolling froze, and I called that in this slide, in terms of the FFCRA prohibition policy, I called that the freeze, just to simplify things. So it's like we took Medicaid and all the people who are going on and off Medicaid, depending on their poverty level or being in collections or getting out of collections and going back on Medicaid, all that bullshit was halted. And they basically said, anyone who's on Medicaid right now, you're staying on Medicaid during the pandemic. So that's like the closest they've ever been to any form of socialized healthcare, and I'm sure a lot of people were upset with it. So this freeze contributed to what became a catastrophic number of new enrollments to the Medicaid system, because at the same time, the FFCRA enrolled over 9 million new Americans on top of the 19 million already enrolled, under an easier system to get enrolled. So they basically lowered the standard for which you had to qualify to be on Medicaid. And a lot of that had to do with debt level. So you had to be like not just regular level poverty, you had to be severely in poverty. And a lot of websites render this like an umbrella. And the umbrella is coverage. So you have the 10 or 15% of people under the umbrella who qualify for Medicaid because they make less than something ridiculous like $22,000 a year, which is about half of Canada's poverty line. So that's really impoverished. So then there's this middle section of people who aren't poor enough for Medicaid because they're making minimum wage, but they're not rich enough for private health insurance because they're making minimum wage, right? So they don't fit in either column, and they've been uncovered by Medicaid, and there's about 20% over here and 15% over here, which leaves 60-something% in the middle who just get fucked out of coverage. So people designing the Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, was trying to take people in that middle part of the umbrella and move them over to Medicaid coverage. And it didn't work for everyone. And that's an entire other presentation. But maybe if we cut that middle section in half and we move it over, we've got like another 30% of people who are now qualifying for Medicaid. And all these people enrolled. So you've got another 9 million people who suddenly have OHIP or suddenly have ACA coverage. And then it's held there because of that freeze. So you can't kick anyone off Medicaid, right? So then I said, when this freeze ends, and they're predicting it's going to end this year, in 2022, continuing layoffs, so the labor market and the privatized insurance prices, which have obviously spiked, may cause the 15 million Americans, so people in this bracket, to lose Medicaid, but also not be eligible for that other side of the umbrella, the private insurance. So 15 million Americans, if you put that in the Canadian context, is half of Canada. Half of all Canadians who live right now would have no health insurance whatsoever. That is shocking. We could have ended the talk here, but we're not. All right. So then I said the original Obamacare, or ACA, had provisions for literally this exact scenario. They could see into the future how this would play out. And they had provisions for what happens when you hold enrollment and spike it, and then you can't afford everybody on this Medicaid through state services, because there's a big differentiation between state-covered health insurance and federally covered health insurance. And when the FFCRA came out, a lot of that burden switched to federal responsibility, and people flipped out about that. But that's another talk also. Under statutes delineating disenrollment and eligibility, so the disenrollment thing is a really complicated issue, and that goes back to the umbrella of people poor enough for Medicaid and people who are poor but not poor enough for Medicaid, which seems almost intentionally developed so that most people just aren't covered, which is why we were calling it kind of a poverty-hating medical system, which is kind of true, in my opinion. This gets really complicated and state-dependent, so disclaimer that how FFCRA works when you map it by state is hugely different, and I didn't want to pick a state to demonstrate this with because you can't do that without picking teams, and I'm trying to make this apolitical. So just trust me that FFCRA executes 50 different ways. But they're all controlled by what's called an FMAP. And the FMAP basically acts as a match rate. So there's this complicated calculation that you can do using the FFCRA guidelines for how much you pay versus the state pays versus the federal government pays. And the number in any context is always disappointing. But the FMAP is really important for what's called subsidization of household. So subsidization of household means my payment amount will be helped out by either the state or federal Medicaid insurance. So to take the Western context, or the University of Western Ontario context, you are probably on an undergraduate healthcare plan, right? And I'm talking to myself, but I'm going to keep doing it. So that healthcare plan probably delineates things like 20% of your dental is covered, and that's covered by a private insurance entity that Western has paid for your coverage, and you have paid for part of that coverage through tuition, but that's subsidized by the school, okay? So if you take that scenario where you're buying into this plan that helps you with absolute base costs on top of your OHIP, your baseline coverage, that's kind of how the ACA and the FMAP are working out. So the FMAP takes your location, your medical history, the federal or the state endorsement amount, and it calculates for you how much coverage you have in that area. So a lot of people did not have a very good match rate. So they were coming up with numbers like an ambulance ride after FMAP subsidization is only $1,000. And that's patient payout. Everything else was subsidized. So can you imagine, as an Ontarian, as an incredibly privileged Ontarian, if you needed to use an ambulance and then you got a bill for $1,000 for needing that core service? That's how Medicaid works right now. So what you need to know about the FMAP, from what I've just explained, is that it does not interact well historically with economic positions. So that basically means if the economy goes downhill, FMAP has to also come down because of how that works between state and federal funding allowances. So when this number goes down, the economic downturn, it pulls FMAP with it, okay? So if they're both going down, the FMAP formula, and I'm reading for the slide, leaves states vulnerable to funding shortfalls, so funding coming down this way as a p-value at exactly the wrong time. Because when you have an economic downturn, you'll remember that also leads to job layoffs, that leads to people unemployed and not able to afford private insurance, that leads to people leaving school to do minimum wage jobs. That means people are losing their homes and becoming increasingly precarious. It means people are losing their businesses. So that's also putting them out of a job. Coronavirus was great for people losing their businesses, awful. So all of those economic factors are drivers for the economic rate dwindling. But because all those factors are also tied to the FMAP rate, this also comes down and you create this kind of perfect storm of so many more people needing federal coverage and so many less people able to get it because it's overwhelming the system, right? Because the people who go on Medicaid are the ones who all of those scenarios are happening to. They lost their business, they became unemployed, they're not able to work, they're not able to go to school, they're not able to do this and that. And now, because both of them are downturning, they also can't afford the basic insurance. So that's kind of a perfect storm scenario, is what I'm trying to get across to you, okay? So the FFCRA allowed all states to increase their match rate. So they tried, you know, because the FMAP is going like this, while the economic situation in the US is going like this, one of the ideas was, okay, we can artificially push the FMAP up by injecting funding to try to solve this problem of rapid unemployment and, you know, rapid people not having any health care. So if you artificially push that FMAP value up by a couple $100 million, you can try to support it having a higher baseline than the economic downturn. And I know I'm using a ton of visual metaphors for this, and I'm sorry, this is really complicated. So they injected almost $100 million per state toward the FMAP value to try to increase that match rate. And you want that match rate to increase because that means more people qualify for FFCRA, right? And it means they pay less in their copay. So if my FMAP value is going higher, it means the state and the government have more money to help me copay for that $1,000 ambulance ride. I hope you're still with me. I know this is ridiculously complicated. This is the easier version. Okay, so as long as that freeze that I talked about at the beginning holds, so all of these people under the umbrella get to hold onto their Medicaid and that heightened match rate, that match rate will also hold. So it's kind of all standing up under this umbrella, hoping that the PHE, which is the policy that enables this to happen, stays in place. But because they've nested these policies, all you need to do is have PHE fail or expire, and it all comes down. It's over. So I put here as a calculation, I think I put it on the next slide to make this easier, and then I forgot to delete it from the other one. So you have the PHE, which is enabling the false inflation, and it's enabling the freeze. It enables FFCRA, which is facilitating the freeze, which allows for FMAP boosting, which is allowing people to actually pay for their medical care. And then all of that put together means that low-income Americans, more of them are covered. But, and this is a big but, the Biden administration has guaranteed PHE the first sub-policy in that nest of policies until next month. Next month is when it's set to be reviewed, and he gives 60 days notice if it's going to expire. So he needs a bunch of people in the House of Congress to agree to extend this nest, okay? However, this policy leaves a huge gap between FFCRA qualifying individuals and private qualifiers. So when we go back to the umbrella that we were talking about and how I said we took about 30% of people from that middle section, this other 30% of people are still screwed. Even if, you know, this nested policy works out properly, they're still out of the new coverage allowance. So that's a problem, and I'm acknowledging that. This is not working for everyone as it is, right? So let's take this, 30-ish% of people and just work with them. So if PHE expires next month, this whole thing explodes. So PHE expires, FFCRA relies on the PHE to execute its mandate, so FFCRA implodes, which means the FMAP boosting implodes, and it goes back to regular levels, which means these low-income Americans, these 9 million new enrollments, pretty much immediately can no longer afford health care. That's terrible. So, let me hit you with some research here. How long do I have left? No time. We'll go through this really quickly. So this is from Forbes. As indicated above, not all workers have access to coverage, private coverage, through their job. 72.5% of non-elderly, so under 75 years of age, uninsured workers working for an employer don't offer health care. So a popular myth about people on Medicaid is that they don't work, they're on disability, they're taking public handouts. 72% of people who work in America are not even offered private health insurance. So, in the words of Maury Povich, that was proven to be a lie, right? Among uninsured workers who are offered coverage by their employers, cost is often a barrier. Total premiums have increased by 55%. This is 2010 to 2020. 55% is huge. That's almost 1.5 times, right? And the workers' share increased, so your copay amount had increased by 40%. So the amount the state pays versus the amount that you pay went up by almost half. That is huge, right? And that outpaced the extent to which their wage increased. So a lot of people, completely artificially, can no longer afford private health care. Okay? If they're even offered it, which apparently only 30% of people even get that as an option. Low-income families with employer-based coverage spend a significantly higher share of their income toward premiums and out-of-pocket copay expenses compared to those with income above 200% FPL. That goes with the FMAP payments. So all the people who have private insurance premiums and they're paying into FMAP, they can only afford it, way more than the people over here who can't afford it. But because they have so much more of the wealth concentrated in that area, they actually pay less copay than the people over here, because over here, where all the poor people are trying to get covered, is costing so much that their premiums are pushed artificially higher. So basically, you get a poor tax added that the people who are using private insurance are not paying. Tell me how that doesn't hate poor people. I will wait. I'm going to skip that next part, but you can pause and read it if you want to. Where am I? I'm here. Okay. So this is from a study that just came out a couple months ago. And they were using data from LendingTree, and they were using data from this other report, which I'll show you. This was also good, the health research policy. What will happen to unprecedentedly high Medicaid enrollment after the public health emergency? This just came out in the fall, and it was a bunch of American speculators looking at what's going to happen when that nesting situation I talked about, crumbles. What's that going to look like in 2022, right? So it says here, LendingTree found that emergency room visits with doctors and specialists, childbirth, and dental care were the leading causes of medical debt that goes to collections. So the only medical debt that they actually start counting is when you default on that debt and it goes to a third-party collector. So something ridiculous like 40-something% of people on Medicaid, it goes to collections, which is awful. So then of those people who went to collections, a lot of the argument politically is that they were opting into healthcare they didn't need. And this chart does a lot of hard work in trying to intercept that mythology. Emergency room visits are almost 40% of why people are defaulting on their Medicaid debt, and we would count emergency room visits as pretty critical care in Canada, right? You don't pay for that here. They pay for that there, and they're defaulting on their payback payments for this, because they're coming up with numbers like $20,000 for 20-hour stay, which is ridiculous. Visits with doctors, childbirth. If you want to have a baby in America, you're going to go into debt for it. That's 22% of collections debt load. Lab fees are getting tests, 18%. Getting anything with your teeth done, 20%. I know that's bad in Canada too. If you need to stay in the hospital, that's really bad news. If you're in America, that's 17%. Prescription drugs, basically nothing mental health related is covered. And there's stuff like insulin, that we're pretty familiar with. It's about $30 in Canada. It's $600 in the States. And we were talking about that a little bit with the lecture where I was talking about Pharma Bro. And that is completely legal policy-wise to do. You can spike that because they own the patent. But it's sending people into debt. And that debt goes to collections, and they can't open bank accounts. They can't get good credit. They can't get apartments with that. They can't get good housing with that. It all comes down like a pile of cards, right? This would ruin your life if you took on too much medical debt. So in the commentary, it said Sesso likened the overall situation with medical debt to that of the subprime mortgage crisis back in 2008. So this is playing out similarly in the House of Cards that I talked to you about as the House of Cards, which could be a completely different lecture about the subprime lending that led to the 2008 financial crisis. So it's the same dynamic of as soon as this goes, it's all coming down. That's really serious, and that's really important. And he goes into a little bit about how that's being facilitated at a policy level by basically letting people enroll subprime and freezing it, and as soon as you unfreeze it, just like how millions of Americans lost homes, they're all going to lose medical coverage. Awful. Really sorry if you're listening to this and you're American. So I've got some examples here, just in case it wasn't hitting home for you how bad this was. We've got someone who says a friend of ours was killed in a motorcycle accident. This is in 2021. Head injury. They asked to harvest his organs within hours of his arriving at the hospital, which his wife agreed to. They sent her a $60,000 bill for the time they kept him alive and for the procedure. And somebody said, how can that be legal? She said they considered it to be life-saving efforts. So part of Medicaid is that there is coverage for some things, but not for other things. And if you fall into life-saving effort and you're still alive when this is being performed, they can charge you for that. So that surgery, which they didn't say in advance, was going to be charged to her, even though he could not survive that surgery. They're literally harvesting his organs. That was worth a ton of money, right? And she's going to go assumably into collections for that $60,000. So now her credit is ruined. She probably has to mortgage or remortgage her home to try to get on top of that Medicaid payment. Ruins your life. Another example, $10K to pay for our daughter's neonatal care 1 year after the fact. Neonatal means they're less than a year old. She died 30 minutes after birth, and our insurance wouldn't pay because we didn't add her to our policy. So because this family didn't add their newborn baby to their Medicaid policy in the first 30 minutes of her life, she was not covered under Medicaid, and they are responsible for the bill for any care that she was given in the 30 minutes she was alive. So she accrued $10,000 in life-saving care in 30 minutes, died anyway, and the parents were sent a $10,000 bill because they didn't enroll her in that 30 minutes. If you Google stories like this, it'll ruin your day. I'll give you a couple more. $600 for my son who lived for about 3 minutes, neonatal. He received no medical care. He died almost immediately. He didn't get enrolled in my insurance plan, so I got the bill. So same situation. She didn't immediately call her insurance broker and add her 3-minute-old son to her policy. She was shipped a bill for that care, or non-care. She was shipped a bill for that son existing in the hospital for those 3 minutes. Gravel Institute. You could do a whole sub-presentation on just American healthcare and GoFundMe, but this is a really great way of summarizing it. 1 in 3 GoFundMe campaigns, that's a crowd fundraising website, is now for medical bills. This is America. GoFundMe is now one of the largest medical insurers in the country. That's incredible. 1 in 3 GoFundMe campaigns is for medical bill payments. So they've gone into collections and they have had to crowdfund their way out of debt. And they're using that as health insurance, right? So you might be thinking, I am from a country with socialized medicine. I don't understand why they're allowed to do this. And the reason for that, not to get into like American philosophy in 3 minutes or less, but basically that they take capitalism to like a whole other level that Canada doesn't really support. So when we think about someone else, particularly someone in our family, they break their leg or they get cancer or they get sick, most Canadians would say, because this is the way we've been raised, speaking for my own generation, that if I pay into a pool a little bit more than other countries do, like America, I can help save that person and have their injuries fixed. And particularly when you make it about someone's own family or somebody they can picture, most people will agree with that statement. And what's different about America, or American exceptionalism, is that they don't see that as their problem. They think, the ultimate kind of atomistic experience insofar as you are responsible for yourself, and in a kind of hyper neoliberalistic sense, if you didn't prepare properly and save up money and do the right things and work hard enough, what happens to you is your fault. And any narratives that interrupt that or fly in the face of that are shot down, like acts of God or getting cancer, etc. They say, oh, that doesn't count. So if you take this atomistic perspective of I am responsible for myself, they are responsible for themselves, if I posit the same argument to people who believe that in the American context, they see that as their problem and they should have saved for that, and they weren't taking care of themselves, therefore they didn't work hard enough, therefore, so on and so forth until you hit capitalism, right? So it's kind of, it's extreme neoliberalism and extreme atomism at work to try to justify why everyone should be essentially out for themselves. And that facilitates what's called the American dream, where if you work hard enough, you'll get anything and everything you've ever wanted. And I can't say that not sardonically, right? So there's a quote here, presumably from a politician. I don't think anybody should be expanding Medicaid. I think it's a mistake to create new and more expensive entitlement programs when we can't afford the ones we've got. We have to stop this culture of government dependence. So that kind of summarizes why Medicaid is a thing whatsoever in one image. And I'm going to skip the other one because it's too complicated. But if you want more data as to who specifically is getting left out care, that data costs $3,000, which I think is kind of a perfect explanation of Medicaid just in itself that I came across in my research. So I can't get too specific with you demography-wise because I don't have $3,000 to spend on this data. I guess I would start a GoFundMe for it, and that would be pretty in line with the American healthcare system. Important for you to know, this is 2020-2021 data. The non-elderly below the FPL rate is about 60% of people. Children below full coverage, 80%. Medicare, people who actually qualified and you're a senior, 20%. So 80% of seniors and disabled people, no Medicare. Great. Pregnant women, only 50% of them are covered. So you flip a coin when you get pregnant. Maybe you're paying $20,000 for that labor. Maybe you're not. Who knows? American healthcare system. It's like a casino. Medical debt is a uniquely American problem from a very broken system. They overcharge for services that are less from overseas. They're buying subprime insurance plans based on that freeze metric. So as soon as that freeze metric expires, millions of people are being unenrolled basically immediately. What are they doing about that? Without getting too political, they have tried to address this freeze problem that ends up collapsing that house of cards in what's called the Build Back Better Act. And I did not read it word for word, but I read the 40-page overview. And basically what it says is that we want to take the FFCRA, we want to keep pumping up that match rate and basically keep that house of cards stable. So we're going to try to prevent all of that from expiring and 19 million Americans losing coverage within the first 6 months, right? That's what all that legalese says. And that passed the House of Representatives in November, but it is now stuck in Senate as of time of recording, and it's stalling out because people I will not name do not like that policy. If that version of Build Back Better does not pass this year, the match rates expires when PHE ends, so as early as next month. The 19 million total enrollments plus the 9 million new enrollments on the simplified Medicaid would lapse and fall into that in-between category of Americans already not covered. And the FMAP increased premium would likely stabilize, but that's not going to be enough for most people who just got booted off Medicaid to get back on it. So I can back that up. I'm not pulling that out of nowhere. This is the prediction from the Urban Institute, that policy report I showed you, and this blue line is the projection. So this is the 12-month disenrollment or people getting kicked off Medicaid. So this is 2020 when coronavirus kind of kicked off. It goes way up toward the end of 2021, fourth quarter is, end of fall, winter. That's when we're freezing. And then projected, if we unfreeze in March, that number spikes all the way back down to baseline. So all the progress they made in getting 9 million more Americans basic health care, getting them OHIP, would have been basically for nothing because all of them immediately lose it. And you can pause this slide and read what they're saying about it because I'm summarizing it really quickly. It's just, it's awful, right? It's awful. So how am I connecting that to crib care with my final 20 minutes? I'm going to do that with Leia's interview that she did with Dale Muhammad and Maria Town. And I watched that live, and it was really awesome. Last year, she was talking with the Washington Post Disability Series about what's called the caregiving crisis. And that's what I want you. So knowing all of what you know now about Medicaid and how many disabled people that is obviously designed to impact as people who would obviously be in the Medicaid coverage zone and about to lose their health care again, there's some really important quotes I want you to pick out from that interview. And I wish you would watch the whole thing because the whole thing was amazing. But if you don't, I'm okay with that. So Day says, and so what happens is what is deemed best for a community, ways to resolve problems, improve living conditions, or standards, it's done based on assumptions. And the basic assumption that runs throughout this whole interview is that disabled people don't know what's best for themselves. That is not true. Obviously. Unequivocally. That's what I'm on about in other lectures about speaking with a community versus speaking for a community. So Day is basically saying, there's a lot of people speaking for disabled people if they acknowledge them at all. And her argument is you should be asking disabled people themselves and speaking with them, which strikes us as a pretty obvious argument, but they have Medicaid, so it's not an obvious argument. Day says, we always give that statistic about the 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people have disabilities, but if you talk about how many families have a family member with a disability, so you expand your circle of impact, that number changes to closer than 103. 1 in 3. I am so fucked up. So when you add in that caregiving element, we talk about the impact as a ripple on the family. So you start to, you're less than 1 in 5, you go to 1 in 3, that goes from about, 60 or 70 million to more like 100 million people out of 300 million people. That is a significant p-value, right? And for good and ill both, there's this expectation that family members will pick up that caregiving role. So as a cultural truism that if somebody in your family acquires a disability or needs extended long-term care, that responsibility often falls to a family member or someone in their immediate community. And this is unpaid labor. And most of that interview is about all the accumulated unpaid labor in CRIP care and what to do about that. So Day says, but when you think about that, that only works for folks that have the money and capacity to do that. So if you think about, if your mom got sick today and you needed to drop out of school to go give her long-term care or continuing care or just do day-to-day life with her, how does that change your life? It does a lot. And for a lot of those people, they're the ones who were covered on Medicaid who now won't be able to qualify because they're going to lose their employment, they're going to lose their economic position because they have to go be a carer. So then it all starts coming together, right? Because not just the disabled person is losing their health care, also the people who are tasked with that CRIP care are jeopardizing their Medicaid to give basic care that's not covered under Medicaid, okay? It's a perfect circle. The Venn diagram of disabled people and people caring for disabled people and people who are not getting medical care is a circle. It's not a Venn diagram, okay? So she says, we heard about retail workers, we heard about folks doing the Uber driving and the Instacart and all these kinds of things, and they're talking to 2 and 3 jobs to bring money in. What does that mean when you have a family member with a disability who requires care? You can't pull those 3 jobs, right? So now all of these things build each other, and I think COVID really highlighted where, from a policy perspective, we've fallen down, because all of that unpaid labor has no impact on the FMAP number. They don't care if you're not making X amount of money, but you're caring 50 hours a week for a family member. But that's 100 million people. That's 1 in 3. So 100 million people are performing CRIP care, allegedly, and they're not being compensated for it, but they're also losing the coverage they could have qualified for to do it. So it's jeopardizing in a number of ways, right? So then Day says, now because of that, the only place currently where you can find a lot of that paid for, and she's talking about care work, is within Medicaid. And one of the issues is the fact that Medicaid has limitations on income, and it has limitations on the assets you can have, right? We talked about that. So to have support, to remain in your home as a person with a disability, you basically have to bring your income level down to the qualifying amount. And a result of that is we hear stories about folks who get divorced to meet that qualifying amount. That way the person would have a low enough income to get the supports they needed. They've had spouses move out because of the way the system is built. You are punishing people for providing community care, right? Leah says, but what I want to lift up is that there's an idea out there that Maria Town and Dave, the moderator, just spoke to really powerfully, that disabled people are passive recipients of care, that we're waiting around, we're invalids in beds, we can't do anything for ourselves. And the reality is that disabled people keep each other alive all the time. And that was kind of the basis for her book called Care Work. So a really great summary of that is we're not waiting for somebody else to save us, we're saving each other. And that there's so many ways that as disabled people we look out for each other. A lot of disabled people I know, myself included, have the experience that whether you're born with a disability or you acquired it, a lot of times people who are able-bodied forget and they're not checking on you. So it becomes this CRIP care community ethic, which I'm going to go into a little bit more. Yeah, I do want to do this quote. So Leah says, as of 2020, women, and this was based on a New York Times investigation that came out, if they were paid for the unpaid care work that we were doing. And she was making a bigger point about Black and particularly Black women performing a lot of this crip care. At minimum wage, if we paid those 100 million people, it would generate $1.5 trillion for the U.S. economy. So I think what we're seeing too is that $400 billion, the projected, ad for care in Medicaid right now, is obviously not peanuts. It's a lot of money. But when you look at what that $400 million, what that labor represents, it's a really, really small fraction of what that labor is worth, was the point she was making. So 1.5 trillion and 400 billion, those numbers are not even in the same universe, right? And America's pretty happy, and so is Canada, really, to leave all that care labor as free and call that unemployment. So that's a big problem. Leah's talking about Beyond Survival. That was an anthology series she did with Dixon. And she says that Dixon says, yeah, my neighbor down the hallway was like, I know you've got asthma. I'm going to wipe down all of the buttons on the elevator with alcohol twice a day. She's like, we looked out for each other. We didn't wait for anyone to come save us. We knew we had to look out for each other as majority Black folks in a building in Brooklyn. And she's like, this is what we've always done. So that's crip care ethics, in action. And if you're interested in this specifically, and I do an extensive amount of research in this, I'm going to suggest to you Care Work from Leah, How We Show Up from Mia Birdsong, The Care We Dream Of from Zena Sharman. Those three are like my aunts. I love them to death. Beyond Survival is a great one from Dixon and Leah. Radical Hope from Kevin Gannon puts it in a specifically academic context. They take radical community care ethics and try to riddle that out for you in a number of examples and instantiations and ways that you can show up literally for your own communities. Okay? So I'm going to skip that. And with the 6 minutes I've got left, I'm going to talk a little bit about community activism. And I took this straight from my Intro Madness presentation because it just works here. If you don't want to go full restorative justice, but you do want to see crip care work in your communities, particularly if you're American and you're going to lose your Medicaid health care, looks like, these communities will become survival points for you, right? So I'm talking about, in terms of the MAD movement or people with mental illness, things like the Asylum Collective or the Neurodiverse Postgraduates Collective. There's MAD reading groups. There's disability reading groups. Anne Gagne runs a great reading group. There's the MAD COVID Storytelling Initiative. And there's other storytelling initiatives for academic ableism. There's stuff for long-term care homes. There's a story weaving group for that. There was another one for long-term disability or for people who have family members in long-term care homes, because that's a whole thing right now. I recommended a bunch of books if you just wanted to learn more. Twitter has really active mini communities. I know a lot of you are using the TikTok communities you've been sharing with me this semester. I think those are great communities to get involved with. Critical Disability Publications will tell you all kinds of initiatives to get involved with. I really love working with the Anti-Ableist Composition Collective, and all they're concerned with is how to teach writing better. And that's like a pet cause. But you can make, pet causes like that your beloved community. And in building that beloved community, you're also building a survival network. And with that survival network, you can ensure things like having an emergency contact. If you don't have a partner and you don't have an immediate family and you need someone at the hospital with you, what do? You need beloved community for that. If you can't afford food that week, inflation and wage have not gone up, even in Canada, at the same rate. There could be a time in 2022 where you can't afford groceries that week and you need crip care community to be able to help you out with that, right? And all of these things are done in reciprocality. So it's not even like you need to say, you know, I'll do the same thing for you. I make food for people, I buy groceries for people, I go do sickbed visits, I go do safety team collectives, I run free seminars, you know, anything that you're good at that you can mobilize, or even if you have a tea, you can give them. That's community care, and that's the care that people like Leah and Day and Mia are talking about. And if I want you to pull anything away from this presentation, it's that you can't rely on superstructures like the government or federal aid or provincial aid or state aid, clearly, to help you when things get tough. So if you're looking at stuff like communities and safety teams and your inner circle, you want to have those things set up in advance, because OHIP is not bulletproof. Medicaid, clearly not bulletproof. It's, you know, a mess. It just objectively doesn't work as a policy. But you can't follow the same atomism as they follow in the American context, because it doesn't work. If everybody lived their life that atomistically and everyone is out for themselves and everything is your fault, and if you work hard enough, bad things won't happen, that doesn't work. Bad things will happen anyway, and you will need help eventually. So building those community connections, building a safety team that knows signals from you or know keywords from you that mean you need help, people you can tap when you've run out of money or you need a new place to live, in my case, that's survival, right? That's why Leah called that newest book Beyond Survival. And I'm hoping that and I'm trying not to be political, but I'm hoping that the direness of the Medicaid situation, we can use that in a productive way to try to get you thinking about what you can do in that direness besides nothing and cry, because those are valid responses, but they're also not going to help you, right? You have no homework, finish your right spaces, finish anything outstanding, record your read around video, take care of yourself, build a safety team. I would love that. I love you, and I'll see you next week.